There they are.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Power to Choose, Negotiating Autonomy and Risk. This is the first in our series on Alzheimer's and dementia and the Greenhouse Project's Best Life Approach. I'm Susan Ryan, Senior Director of the Greenhouse Project, and I'm delighted to be with you today, especially on this incredible webinar. But before I introduce today's speaker, Dr. Al Power, I have just a few housekeeping details and future opportunities that I'd like to share. Want to let you know that you are in listen-only mode, but you will be able to ask questions or a comment through our chat box, and that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. Additionally, there are handouts that are available for download. They are also on the right-hand side of your screen. And what you have there is our Best Life brochure. That's the Greenhouse Project's memory care approach, as well as Dr. Power's PowerPoint. If for some reason you have trouble accessing the download, we can email those directly to you. So just let us know if you're having a problem. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a link in the next few days following the session. Thank you again for joining this insightful webinar, and I hope you'll plan to participate in all of our upcoming sessions. Our next webinar, Essential Elements of Financial Viability, will feature our greenhouse consultant, Terry Saltz-Metzger, and she will provide highlights from a recent financial survey that we've done among greenhouse adopters. Additionally, if you happen to live in the western part of the country, we invite you to attend one of our 2 upcoming greenhouse workshops in either Loveland, Colorado on April 18 or Portland, Oregon on May 31st. I think the workshop is one of those incredible opportunities for you to visit open greenhouse homes and have what I call a seeing is believing experience, and the opportunity to really interact with the elders that live there and the staff that are there to support them. And if you have interest in those webinars or workshops, you can visit our website and get registered for that. So now on to our topic today. Dr. Al Power is our speaker. I'm going to read his bio, which, let me tell you, is impressive. And I'm most excited that I can also call him my friend. But Dr. Al Power is a board-certified internist, geriatrician, and newly appointed Schlegel Chair in Aging and Dementia Innovation at the Schlegel University, Waterloo Research Institute for Aging in Ontario, Canada. He is also Clinical Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Rochester, New York, a Fellow of the American College of Physicians, American Society for Internal Medicine, and an international educator on transformational models of care for older adults, particularly those living with changing cognitive abilities. He is internationally respected for his work challenging the use of antipsychotic medications for people living with dementia. In fact, Dr. Power has advised the U.S. government in their antipsychotic reduction initiatives and was named one of 5 leaders of tomorrow by Long-Term Living magazine in 2013. He is the author of 2 influential books, which I highly recommend: Dementia Beyond Drugs, Changing the Culture of Care, and his second book, Dementia Beyond Disease, Enhancing Well-Being. Dr. Power was a member of the Scientific Program Committee and a keynote speaker for Alzheimer's Disease International. In 2015, it was held in Perth, Western Australia. Dr. Power was awarded a Bellagio residency in Italy in 2012 by the Rockefeller Foundation, where he worked with Dr. Emi Kyoda on developing guidelines for sustainable communities that embrace people of all ages and abilities. Dr. Power has a 20-year history of implementing culture change in aged care settings, leading St. John's Home in Rochester, New York, to becoming the world's largest Eden Alternative registered home, and helping St. John's open the only community-integrated greenhouse homes in the United States, where I was fortunate to meet Dr. Power at that time and enjoyed getting to work with him as we implemented the greenhouses there. Dr. Power recorded introductory material for the CMS educational package, Hand in Hand, designed to help hands-on staff better care for people living with dementia. He has served in an advisory capacity with CMS and worked with the U.S. Dementia Action Alliance to produce 2 white papers on new approaches to dementia. And if that's not enough, I think something that you might not know about Dr. Power is that he's a trained musician and songwriter. I find it fascinating that his songs have been recorded by several artists and performed on 3 continents. Peter, Paul, and Mary performed his song of elder autonomy, If You Don't Mind, and Walter Cronkite used his song, I'll Love You Forever, in a 1995 Discovery Channel profile of American families. I couldn't be more pleased to introduce to you my esteemed mentor, co-collaborator, and my good friend, Dr. Al Power.
Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate the very extensive introduction. I hope we have time left for the talk, but I think we probably do. Thanks everybody for being on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be on and working with the Greenhouse Project, working with Susan and Rachel, and speaking with all of you. I am going to launch right into this talk now, and I would like to start with maybe a story. This has become a favorite story of mine for this topic because it really speaks to the heart of what I'm going to talk about today. And I'll go through the slides as I do so. This is actually an opening half story. I'm going to give you the first half, and then we'll come back toward the end of the talk and give you the punchline to this. Since I've been working at Schlegel Villages and the RIA up in Ontario part-time, one of the amazing people I've met up there is Heather Luth, who is now the Dementia Program Coordinator for Schlegel Villages, but several years ago was a recreation therapist at one of the villages called the Village of Wentworth Heights. And when I first met Heather a couple of years ago, I came up to tour the Village of Wentworth Heights and was let into the building, which had a key code on the door where I came in by a gentleman who I'm calling Fred. And I heard Fred's story, and it's quite striking. And actually, Susan was up touring the village a few weeks ago after a conference, and she got to meet him as well at the village. Fred he lives with Alzheimer's disease. He was living home alone for quite some time. Had a son that was around, but not very often, so it was not really a primary support. And it got to the point where he was having more trouble managing alone at home, and it was decided he should move to the Village of Wentworth Heights and more of their assisted living area. So he moved in, and he lived in an area where he could roam the living area and some of the adjacent parts of the community fairly freely, but the outer doors were alarmed. And immediately upon moving in, Fred became extremely distraught, upset, pounding on the doors, yelling, complaining, saying he wanted to go outside, causing quite a bit of disruption and distress to both the team members and the other elders alike. And it immediately was identified as an issue. And the team met together and started talking about, what should we do about this? Does he need medication? What do we do? And so Heather decided to sit down and talk to Fred and find out what he was experiencing. And what he told her was that he's a Polish-Canadian gentleman who has lived in Canada for many, many years, but he was a spy for the Allies during World War II and was captured by the Germans, was in a German POW camp until it was liberated by the Allies at the end of the war. He talked about his life, his marriage, his family, his work, and he concluded by saying, now here I am, I'm 90 years old, and I'm a prisoner once again. So Heather asked Fred, what would you do if you could go out that door? And Fred said, I'd like to sit on that bench out there, sit in the sun, and feed the birds. And so Heather went back to the team and said, do you think we could teach Fred the code for the door? Well, there was some skepticism there, partly because people worried about his safety, partly because people were skeptical as to whether he could even operate or learn the code. But they decided to give it a try. It did take a bit more repetition than it might take for you or me, but within a couple of weeks, Fred was able to learn the code and learn it well and operate the door independently. And he began going outside, sitting in the sun, feeding the birds, and his distress melted away, and there were no more episodes of being upset or angry as a result. Now, this went on quite well for several months, but at some point, Fred started talking to the team about how he would love to go back and check on his old house. And he had a cafe where he used to meet some of his old buddies, and they'd have a drink or a snack and talk with each other. And he wanted to go back and meet them. And being burdened with a lot of tasks, the team would kind of put him off and say, well, maybe when your son comes back to visit, he could take you out sometime. But his son didn't come in that often. And they just kept sort of putting off his requests. Well, one day, Fred was sitting out there feeding the birds, and the city bus pulled up. In Hamilton, Ontario, if you're a senior citizen, you can ride the buses for free. So you'll never guess what Fred did. He got up, got on the bus, and disappeared. Well, the staff talked about what had happened, and they kind of had an idea where he would be. So one of the team members drove to the community or drove to the cafe where he used to hang out. And there he was talking to a buddy, and he greeted the team member warmly, happily rode back to Wentworth Heights with him. And so the question the team asked themselves when they met again was, what do we do now? So with that provocative question, I'm going to move into the talk, and then we'll come back and talk about what the team did and what's happened since that time. I'm going to share a couple of what I consider remarkable quotes to kind of frame this discussion. The first one is from one of my favorite books on dementia, written by Ruth Bartlett and Deborah O'Connor, called Broadening the Dementia Debate Towards Social Citizenship. And as you can see, their quote that I like is, oppressive and discriminatory practices often have their foothold in the well-meaning, well-intentioned ideas of those least intending to do harm. In other words, we're not bad people, but sometimes in our kindness and caring, we actually step on people's rights and even can be seen to oppress them. The second quote is from my good friend and colleague, Daniela Greenwood, who's a consultant in Australia. He used to work for Our Care Aged Care for many years. And this is a very challenging statement, but I just love it. What Daniela says is much of what we call person-centered care is simply bossing people around in a very individualized way. In other words, I know all about you, and therefore I can decide what you need. And I think that that is all too commonly the case. So just a very quick approach for those of you who haven't heard me speak a lot in the past. My approach to dementia, which is quite different from the traditional biomedical approach, really rests on three pillars. The first one is to redefine dementia, not simply as brain disease, but through the lens of shifting experience. And I define dementia as a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. The second pillar is setting my primary outcome as enhancing several different aspects of well-being, which we'll talk about. And the third is the culture change piece. It's neither a beautiful mindset or a beautiful idea of how to care better will work very well unless you also can change your approach to care to meet those new philosophies. In doing this, I've taken one framework for well-being. This framework was developed by 10 culture change specialists back in 2005 on a grant from the Eden Alternative. And they were asked to go beyond the typical quality of care, quality of life indicators that are in nursing home surveys and to say what is deeper, what are universal human needs that are not very well acknowledged or captured or perhaps fulfilled for people living in aged care. And they came up with 7 what they call domains of well-being. And I've taken those 7 domains in my second book, and I've reordered them in a way that works for me and applied them to the experience of people with dementia. And then I've also taken them and put them into a little pyramid like this, sort of a Maslow's type pyramid. And those 7 domains, the way I've ordered them, are identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy. Now currently trademarked as the Eden Alternative domains of well-being, but ordered this way because putting them in this sort of hierarchy gives me a lot of insight. I'm not suggesting certain domains are more important than others, but that if you want to help restore well-being to a person such as someone living with dementia, there's a logical sequence. And I put identity and connectedness at the bottom because it's very hard to support well-being for a stranger. So the deep knowing and the relationship always come first in my mind. Now, security is not at the bottom like it is with Maslow, where he talks about food and safety and shelter, because security is more than physical safety. It's actually also emotional and psychological security. It could be trust, familiarity, modesty, dignity, balance, and all those things require that relationship and that deep knowing. I'd like you to just look at autonomy now. This is where we're talking about choice and control, and it's up there on the second level. And I like this graphic I've created with the pyramid because it shows that autonomy is touching several other domains of well-being. It's sitting on top of identity and connectedness. It's side by side with security, and it's supporting the level with meaning and growth. So if we look at it that way, there are these points of contact that autonomy has with several of the other domains. And these are both points of contact, but they can be points of conflict as well. So if autonomy is supported by the layer of identity and connectedness, then practices that erode one's sense of identity and connectedness will also erode their ability to make choices. Autonomy and security are side by side, so there's a very tenuous dynamic between the two of them. A good sense of security can improve decision making, but an over-reliance on safety sometimes has the opposite effect. And then thirdly, autonomy supports meaning and growth. And we won't spend a lot of time on this today, but just basically to say, if you want to do something that is truly meaningful, and if you want to grow as a person, then you have to be able to have some control over your life, and you have to be able to take a little bit of risk in your life as well. Failure-free activities do not produce any degree of meaning. So I'm going to talk about these in detail, a little bit about the first two, and mostly spend the time on autonomy and security. So how could erosion of identity and connectedness affect a person's sense of autonomy? Well, here are some ways in which we well-meaning people can often erode people's autonomy through our lack of support of identity and connectedness. The biggest one probably is the stigmas around dementia. If we believe the person truly is incapable or is fading away or is no longer there, you can bet that there's no chance we're going to assume or even believe that it's possible for them to make choices. And as a result, we often have low expectations for people and don't put them in the situation where they can even make choices or have the ability to show what they're capable of, and that can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. We often in practice will exclude people with dementia from our discussions and decision making, and once again, that erodes people's autonomy. Communication and care practices are very important. So for instance, if we do not sharpen our communication skills and sharpen our skills for understanding, if we don't sharpen our ability to facilitate tasks with people, then we may be shutting down their ability to have control or to express their needs and desires. Care systems and staffing patterns, if we rely too much on time and task and not on people, or if we're rotating our team members so that you're constantly being moved to care for people you don't know well, there's no way that you're going to trust that person's decision-making ability well enough to help them to negotiate risk for safer decisions. Staging systems, assessments, categorizations are all very deficit-based, all based on what's missing in people. And one of the biggest examples is this framework of what's called biological and psychological symptoms of dementia, which I'm going to talk about a little bit and critique. And lastly, segregated living environments can also erode autonomy. And I'm just going to take these last two bullet points and spend a couple minutes talking about them before we go into the whole idea of security. What's the problem with BPSD? Well, first of all, what it says is that these expressions, whether they be words or actions, are due to brain disease. So if someone strikes out during a shower or is trying to leave a locked living area or is calling out, they're doing it because their diseased brain is making them do it. If you think about that, that is actually probably the biggest barrier to reducing inappropriate medications, because if you really believe that the disease is causing it, of course you're going to give somebody a pill for it. And so this is really a barrier to critical thinking because it stops you from looking at other factors that might be behind the person's distress, such as relational factors or the environment or the person's personal history. We often pathologize things that would bother any of us. So if someone gets upset during a shower, we have to think about what would it be like for one of us if someone we didn't know came in and took our clothes off and bathed us. Would we find that difficult? And does that mean we have a BPSD? Or someone like me who enjoys the outdoors and likes to move around a lot, how long could I last living in a locked living area before I started to climb the walls? Probably not very long. But if you have a label of dementia, all of a sudden it becomes a behavior to just want to express the normal urge to walk and explore. This system uses flawed categorization. There's really no evidence for this framework. It was not developed with any kind of a research base. It was actually developed with a grant from Janssen Pharmaceuticals. And many of the psychiatrists who developed the framework come from countries such as UK and Australia, where Janssen's drug Risperdal has been made legal to give to people with dementia if you document a BPSD in the chart. So you can see how the pharmaceutical influence actually created a way to give a bad drug legally to people with dementia. It doesn't explain why there are 150 or more communities in the United States that use 0% antipsychotics and hundreds more that use just a couple percent or less. And so this is really missing the boat as far as trying to understand what people are experiencing. When we talk in Canada about people's expressions, we're not labeling them as challenging behaviors or difficult behaviors, which really blame the person and don't suggest that there could be other causes of how the person's expressing themselves. So we talk about personal expressions, which are simply, I'm expressing myself through words or actions. And it's up to the people around me to interpret what I'm expressing. In my many years of working in long-term care and years of working with people living with dementia, I've found that most people who are not acutely medically ill, when they have these different expressions, are expressing one or more of 7 different categories. And I've written them here for you. The biggest one is probably that there are unmet needs or challenges to those domains of well-being, which are leading to a person's actions or their distress. Another one is sensory challenges, both between aging and developing certain types of dementia. There are changes in the 5 senses, so changes in vision, hearing, even touch, taste, or smell, which can lead to distress. I met a woman in Toronto with Alzheimer's who could no longer shower underneath the shower nozzle because the sensation of water hitting her whole body was overwhelming to her for some reason due to the changes from Alzheimer's. So her solution was to sit in the shower chair and use a nozzle and just give herself little bits of rinsing one part of her body at a time. But imagine bathing someone like that who can't speak easily and not understanding why they're striking out and not knowing that with Alzheimer's you can have a change in the way water might be sensed on the skin. Another area is new communication pathways. So if I can't find the words to express my needs the way I used to, I may use symbolic or emotion-based speech, or I may use gestures or actions to express what I'm trying to communicate. It may be just a new way of seeing the world when you have some deficits from dementia. I mean, dementia is real. I'm not saying it's not, but I see dementia mainly through some of the deficits like memory impairment or difficulty communicating or difficulty coping with stressors as enablers of distress. They might make it more likely for a person with dementia to become upset than you or I in a similar situation, but they're not the root cause. And when we see dementia as the root cause, that's when we stop looking for other solutions. It could be a response to other aspects of the environment, the relationships with the people who are supporting you, or the physical aspects of the environment, noise, commotion, temperature, all the various things that we know to think about. It could be a perfectly normal reaction considering the circumstances as I described. And lastly, it could be something that's not upsetting people. They may not appear distressed, but they could be doing something that might be threatening to their dignity or personhood, such as coming out of the room not fully dressed. And in that case, the person may not be unhappy, but it's still our responsibility to respond to them and to preserve their dignity. So these are the 7 things I see almost all the time. And there will never be any medication, antipsychotic or otherwise, that will ever help these 7 things. And this is why being stuck in the idea that people need a pill is missing the boat, and why saying that these are symptoms of dementia is really missing the boat. So what I often say to people is if you see somebody who's expressing themselves in a certain way and you're concerned and you want to respond to them and you're trying to understand what's going on, if you are told what all the journal articles and media say, which is 90% of people living with dementia will experience a BPSD, behavioral and psychological symptom of dementia during the course of their illness. Sorry, I mislabeled it. Behavioral and psychological is the correct abbreviation, symptom of dementia. What do you think the cause is, and what would your responses be? And how might you see that person differently if it's instead we taught you this, that 90% of people living with dementia will find themselves in the situation in which their well-being is not adequately supported. Now, how do you think the source of the person's distress is? Where do you think it is? Where does the fault lie? And what are the range of options you might use? You can see here that medications would go way down the list compared to the first expression. Now, segregated living can also erode autonomy. First of all, because almost always the doors are locked. And so you lose the ability to choose to come and go as you please. And we'll talk a little bit about that idea of unlocking doors, although the process of doing that is another whole talk or more. It's probably going to be my next book, but we'll just give some lip service to it. But the biggest thing probably is, and there may be exceptions to this, but I've traveled the world. I have yet to meet anybody who lived in a segregated locked living area who toured all the various living options and decided for herself, yes, I want to live there in that locked place with all people with dementia living around me. It's virtually always decided by someone else. And so just the lack of choice in determining where you're going to live is an erosion of autonomy right from day one. There's often lack of individualization because we say we see the individual, but when we start doing dementia programming and dementia care planning, we start seeing more of a homogeneous block of people, and we stop seeing the various individual attributes. Stephen Sabat always said that when you have people that are in more diverse settings, there is contact with more able, what he called social personae. People that may have more cognitive abilities may actually stimulate people with dementia to model and pattern and to do more than they can when they don't have that kind of exposure. And lastly, if there's stigma among the people that work there, if there are low expectations because everybody there has dementia, then once again, this can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies where people don't do as well as they would in an integrated living area because we expect less and we don't provide the environment where they can do more. And this particularly applies to decision-making and choice. Now let's talk about security and autonomy. This is the big area, and it's a fragile dynamic. As I said, it can be a help or a hindrance to autonomy. There are two practices we see in all living environments that tend to erode autonomy for people living with dementia. The first one is what I'm calling all or none thinking, and the second one is surplus safety. So let's unpack those for a moment. All or none thinking is literally that, black and white. He can do it or he can't do it. She can decide that or she can't decide it. It is based on stigmas that people are incapable, not being able to see that there are nuances and different levels of ability. It's not all or none. Misunderstanding our role as carers, thinking we have to take over for people. Misunderstanding what empowerment is. And we do this as much with our team members who report to us as we do with the people who live in long-term care, thinking that it's either all or none and not understanding what empowerment's really all about. And lastly, inflexible care systems. So maybe if the system were more flexible, you could individualize decision-making among people's capabilities, but the system is just so rigid that you have to default to no one can do it because there's no other way you can get your heads around it. Surplus safety is excessive concern with downside risk relative to upside risk. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, the word risk doesn't have to be good or bad. All risk really is what are the chances that something will happen that's different than what I expect? So we know what downside risk is. What are the chances something will be worse than I expect? So for instance, if Susan were to get up and walk on her own, what are the chances she could fall and break a bone? Or if Rachel were to go outside, what are the chances she might get lost and maybe step into traffic? Or if Rebecca goes to an activity that she's never been to before, what are the chances that she'll find it confusing or overwhelming? These are real and we have to think about these things, but there's also upside risk, which is what is the chance that something will turn out better than expected? So if Susan gets up and walks, what are the chances she'll actually improve her gait and balance and be more independent and stronger? If Rachel goes outdoors, what are the chances that she will get more exercise? She'll sleep better at night. Her mood and enjoyment of the day will be better. And if Rebecca goes to an activity, what are the chances that she will actually engage, learn something new, and grow in her life experiences, make new friends? So we have to look at both sides. What's the downside? But we also have to look at the potential upside. The problem is with dementia, nearly all of our focus is on the downside risk, as you can see by that little seesaw at the bottom of the slide. And the thing with surplus safety is that it erodes critical thinking skills among staff members. So I'm going to tell you two quick stories that are indicated by these photos. The first one comes from my good friend Karen Stobie, who uses improv and theater to help teach better ways to engage people living with dementia. And Karen's mother lived with Alzheimer's for many years, and for almost a decade, she lived with Karen and her husband Mundy at their house, and they supported her quite a bit. But it got to the point a couple of years ago where they felt that Karen's mother needed more support than she was getting at home, and they began to look at assisted living environments. Well, one day Karen and her mom were touring one such place, and they were walking through the living area, and Karen looked out the door and saw a courtyard a lot like the one on the slide, a beautiful place with paving, with chairs or benches, with a lovely raised garden, a fence around it. It was a beautiful sunny day, and she instinctively went over and tried to open the door, but the door was locked. And she turned to the woman giving the tour and said, "Is the door always locked?" And the woman said, "Oh, yes, people can't go out there." And Karen said, "Well, why? I mean, it's a beautiful day. You've got a nice fenced in area with seats." And the woman said, "Well, it used to be open, but somebody fell out there and got hurt." And Karen said, "Well, tell me, has anyone ever fallen indoors and gotten hurt before?" In other words, we don't tell people they can't live indoors anymore because someone fell and got hurt. So once again, this sort of surplus safety policy made them just stop thinking critically about the risk is that an individual might fall. It's not whether they're indoors or outdoors. It doesn't mean you should deprive everybody of a living area just because someone falls down. On the other side, well, I gave a talk like this at Mayo, at the Mayo event a couple of weeks ago. So that's Tom Lehman, who's a Minnesota golfer. But what someone like Tom Lehman would do if he's hitting a shot toward the green like this in the golf tournament is he would test the wind. And if the wind is coming out of the right at 10 miles an hour, he might aim his shot a little bit toward the right so that the wind will blow it back toward the hole. That's pretty common among good golfers, not people like me who just hope the ball goes up in the air and goes somewhere. But when I think about our traditional policies in long-term care, this is what we do instead. If we were a golfer, what we would do with our traditional policies is we would say, you know, back in 2008, there was a wind coming out of the left at 50 miles an hour because of a big storm. And we should always aim the ball there just in case that wind ever happens again. And if Tom Lehman played golf like that, what are the chances he would ever succeed? And when we fill our policies and procedures only around imagining the worst case scenario and always basically planning our policies toward that one unlikely event, how likely are we to meet the needs of the folks we serve? So here's Bill Thomas with remarkable quote number 3. The only risk-free human environment is a coffin. This is an inevitability. Risk is part of life. Every time you get in the car, hop on the bus, go somewhere, speak up in a meeting, you are taking some sort of a risk. And you, of course, are balancing that against the reward of doing what you're doing. And we have to understand that the same is true for people living with dementia. So how do we support autonomy in dementia? Well, first shift to relational autonomy, which I'll explain in a moment. We have to improve our communication and facilitation skills. We have to consider a spectrum of ability and look at the upside as well as the downside. And instead of trying to eliminate risk, which is impossible, it's doomed to failure, what we have to do is what I'm calling to negotiate risk. And I'll talk about that as well. So what's relational autonomy? Well, this is what my friend Daniela Greenwood, who I quoted, has been working with a lot in Australia and gave a keynote at the same ADI conference where I was also a keynote. We shared the stage that day. And she mentioned that all choices take place within a network of relationships, whether we decide what to make for dinner or whether we should show up at work on time or what we're going to do on a weekend. We're usually taking the concerns of other people, family members, friends, or society into some sort of account as we make our day-to-day decisions. And we have to understand that some relationships around a person can enhance their ability to choose or inhibit their ability to choose. And it's important for us as care partners to have deep knowing and to develop trust with the person and with that person's other care partners, including family members. And the part of our duty of care as professionals is to identify and attend to any relationships that are depleting person's autonomy, which means also when we see family members or other professional care partners who are eroding the choice of a person with dementia, we need to use our relationship with them to try to help them, to teach them how to do otherwise, to protect the autonomy of that person. This requires a partnership approach, and it requires not substituted decision making, but supported decision making, where we work with the person in support, giving them the help they need to be able to decide to the greatest extent what they want to do. And this has implications for how we assign our staffing. Needless to say, it means that rotating staffing should not be done. And once again, another whole talk, but Daniela has done some amazing and world-leading work with her former business, our care, to have 100% dedicated staff assignments across 33 communities in Australia, which achieved a number of quality of life and quality of care outcomes simply by putting the same people with the same people all the time. How do we optimize relational skills? Well, remember that the first level of empowerment, before we even get to whether or not dad can drive the car, it's good communication skills. When people have trouble making their needs known or remembering, we have to really hone our skills at speaking and understanding. If we don't, then we're disempowering people right from the word go. So understand how people's communication changes or what the barriers are. Understanding that people have embodied expressions of choice, where they may express choice through their actions rather than words. And promote the knowledge of those care partners, the people that are spending most of the time with the person, who have very valuable knowledge just because they're near the person. And they get to know them even beyond words. Even the person that doesn't speak, you'll have maybe a Shabazz or a CNA say, you know, I really know Mary, I'm with her every day, and I think she's okay right now. I don't think she wants to be bothered, or I don't think she wants that. I think she'd rather be here. That's very important, and it doesn't come with a degree. It comes with experience, and it's something that we really need to value more than we do. It means working together with the person through tasks and soliciting frequent consent and input through every stage of a task. In my second book, I wrote what I consider the 7-step process to negotiating risk with a person with dementia. The first is to just discuss what the person wants to do and find out what it means to them, why they want to do it. The second is to explore their values, how they value risk and how it ties into their well-being. The third is to understand that there are many different conditions of good empowerment. And the fourth is that there's a continuum. It's not all or none, but people may be able to be empowered to some extent with some help or with some limitations. The fifth is to then try to make a decision in as collaborative a way as possible with the person. And then there are 2 other steps. One is to document and monitor the results for 2 reasons. Number one, because you might not get it right the first time, and if things don't work out perfectly, you can go back and tweak the plan a little bit. The second reason is that people's abilities can change over time, as we'll see with Fred, and you might need to go back and revise the plan. And lastly, keep other stakeholders abreast. That might be family members, it might be other team members, it might be regulators, not so that they can veto your decision, but it just isn't smart to make decisions like this and not let other people know what you've decided and why. You don't want somebody walking in and seeing a loved one doing something that they had no idea the person would do. It's just a way of setting yourself up for conflict. Now, that second step about discovering people's risk and reward values is very important, because we all view risk and reward differently. If you go to a financial planner, the first question you'll always get is, what's your tolerance for risk? Because everybody's different. So here are 2 people that Daniela gave me for my book, real life people she knew that demonstrate this. Joan worked all her life as a milliner in the same factory. She lived in the house that she grew up in, that her parents died in. She went to the same church all her life before moving to long-term care. She rarely went outside her usual neighborhood areas, and she was very distraught when her favorite shop changed hands back in the 1970s. So that's Joan. Harry, on the other hand, was a high-rise builder. He scaled some of the tallest buildings in Melbourne, Australia. He also loved to drink lots of red wine and tramp around the outback looking for new adventures. Freedom was very important to him. So do you think that you can come up with a policy and procedure, one policy and procedure that will satisfy both Joan and Harry? It's impossible, and that's why we have to do what we need to do to find those individual nuances and not just come up with blanket rules that are black and white and that punish everybody and satisfy no one. So let's go back to Fred. What did they do with Fred? Well, a lot of things could have happened, but what the team did at Wentworth was they decided not to change the care plan. That was 4 years before I met Fred. And when I came to Wentworth and met him, and Heather told me the story, she told me that as of that time, Fred had taken the bus 3 times over 4 years. And each time he'd gone to his cafe, and each time the team had picked him up and brought him back without incident. Now, there are two ways you can look at this. One way to look at this is to say, oh my God, those are 3 times in the past 4 years when something disastrous could have happened. He could have gotten lost. He could have suffered an injury. He could have gotten run over by a car. Anything could have happened. But the team looked at Fred as an individual and they said, he actually showed some good executive planning and function here. He knew what he wanted to do. He got on the bus. He rode it properly. He got off in the right place. He went where he said he was going to go. He willingly came back when people came to pick him up. So this is not the same level of danger as a person who disappears and then is found wandering down the middle of the road, distraught, saying, who am I? Where am I? It's a whole different individual, and you can't look at those two people the same. So yes, there were 3 opportunities in 4 years where Fred could have gotten hurt, but balance that again, what would have happened if they had kept him locked up for 4 years? 1,500 days nearly of daily distress, agitation, pounding on the door, disturbing others, anger, feeling like a prisoner, maybe giving up or maybe being medicated with a dangerous medicine like an antipsychotic, which might have even caused physical and functional and cognitive decline due to the side effects of the pill. That's a very negative outcome too. I would argue much more so than the risk of those 3 episodes. And so once again, you can't just look at one side or the other. And I'm not telling the story to tell you that this is absolutely the only answer you can use, but just to explain that this is what you have to go through. These are the kinds of discussions you need to have. Risk is not something you can eliminate. You have to look at the upside and the downside. Now, downside risk is real. You can't ignore it. But you start with those close relationships. The better you know a person, the better you'll be able to assess their capacity and to minimize the downside risk. And use incremental steps to minimize downside. So for example, if you're doing something like trying to eliminate all the alarms, chair alarms on your neighborhood, instead of just taking them all off at once or choosing the person who you think will be hardest to be safe without an alarm, start with somebody easy. Figure out what they need to be safe without an alarm. And 2 things happen as you do these stepwise, one person at a time. First of all, you have a learning curve. Each time you work with another person and are able to release the alarm, you learn something more about how to do it well. The second thing is, in order to keep people safe, your team has to make slight shifts in how you operate during the day to meet that person's needs. And by the time you get to that person who you thought was impossible, you will have made so many little shifts in how you operate and how you relate to each other that that person will be a lot easier than you maybe thought when you looked at things from the beginning. So once again, start by minimizing downside, get the early victories, and slowly shift. And never ask what's the risk of doing something without also asking what's the risk of not doing it, and balance the upside with the downside at all times. Because often the risk of something terrible happening is not nearly as great as the risk of something significantly bad happening when you keep somebody from doing something. And so I wrote a 4-part blog on changing aging back in 2016 called The Hidden Restraint, where I talked about locked doors as being a restraint, and I addressed this issue of downside and upside risk. And so I'll just share this quote with you at the end of part 4, and the link to Changing Aging is on the bottom there. An injury or death after leaving a building is a serious event and would likely be reported all over the news. The gravity of such outcomes is not to be minimized, but for every person who actually suffers such a fate, how many people on a daily basis are forced to live with anxiety, fear, and life-giving needs that remain unmet, or withdraw and give up on life as many prisoners of war have done, or become over-medicated with dangerous and sedating drugs as a result of their distress? Hundreds or thousands? These are also very newsworthy negative outcomes that will start to be more widely publicized as consumer awareness grows. We must always negotiate risk, balancing it against the ability to live life to the fullest extent possible. Now, every time I talk about this, I'll anticipate a couple of questions. People always say, I really support this idea, but we've got these family members and we've got these regulators and we got these lawyers who are threatening us with sanctions if anything bad happens and don't give us room to breathe, let alone enable choice. And all I can say about that is it starts with wide education and relationships. So if you're going to educate yourselves about negotiating risk, you have to educate family members, you have to educate regulators, you have to educate society about this. And hopefully my generation, the baby boomers, will start to be more demanding along these lines. And as we start to understand that dementia has been included recently with the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that gives a lot of rights to people with dementia that currently are not being fulfilled in most long-term care, then we'll start to have these discussions and hopefully start to shift the balance. I can tell you, as someone who started left private practice and started working in long-term care back at around 1991, that I've seen some changes over the years. Back when I started was right when the push was on to remove physical restraints. And we started doing that in my first nursing home job. And there were times when, frankly, there were family members who said, if you untie my mother and she falls, I'm going to sue you. And we had to deal with that. But there wasn't too many years before family members were saying, if you tie my mother, I'm going to sue you. And the same thing happened with antipsychotics. We had people that wanted their relatives sedated, wanted them quiet, didn't want you looking for other avenues because they liked the way the pill kept people from making a lot of commotion or being distressed. But the last years I was at St. John's, when I had a public phone number, I was getting several cold calls a year from family members or lawyers all over the country who wanted me to come testify at trials where they were actually suing nursing homes for giving antipsychotics to their loved ones. And I think we're going to see the same thing with choice and risk. I think we're going to see the pendulum start to swing because the people who are advocating for their human rights are more and more starting to move toward long-term care. People with dementia are advocating on an international level. And so I think that hopefully we will start to have much more balanced discussions around these things. And I'm going to leave you with one more quote, which is a quote of mine, and that is that perhaps the most dangerous situation for people living with dementia may well be the self-fulfilling prophecy, not the actual risk of physical harm. And I think I'm going to stop right there. And here are a few pictures from the folks at St. John's Penfield Greenhouse Homes. Their former dog, Lexi, who sadly passed away about a year ago, and a couple of their remarkable residents, as well as a trip to one of the local farm markets at Halloween time a couple of years ago. So I'm going to turn this back over to Susan and Rachel, see what's in the chat box, and we should have plenty of time for a bit of discussion before the hour is up. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Al. That was tremendous. And I know that you probably aroused some questions. I'm sure there are those sitting out there that are like, well, yeah, but what about? So I'm really encouraging you. You know, Al is the type of person, I know him well, that it's like, let's talk about it. You know, bring me your toughest situation. Where did you feel challenged? Where did you feel something he might have asked you to do or thought you should consider would be an outlandish thought to you? So would love your questions. And sure. I can tell you that Dr. Power is certainly one that is not, he's not afraid if you're pushing back or taking issue with what he might have said.
No, not in the least. And I understand because, you know, when I say I worked in long-term care for 25 years, I wasn't a doctor who came in from private practice once a month and saw a few residents. I was in a large community that Susan knows well with a full-time medical staff. My office was there and my work was there. I went to every care plan, every team meeting. I knew the team members on all the shifts. And so I understand the realities of these struggles. And I hope I didn't make this sound simpler than it is. I actually wanted to make it sound complex and say, these are the kinds of things you need to do. You should have figured out by now that I wasn't here to give you any black and white carved in stone answers to what you can do in every situation, but just to give you some principles and a process to start to address these in a meaningful way with the people that you support.
So Al, we've got a couple, I see a question. It says, how do you balance a combative patient with autonomy?
to me, a combative patient is all about autonomy. So and when I do my training sessions, I often talk about resistiveness during care. And I talk about a well-being approach. And my personal feeling when I look at those 7 domains of well-being is that when people are resistive during care, it is mostly around the domains, right on that same level of security and autonomy. And so how does that work? Well, in the case of security, people are more likely to resist someone if they feel insecure or frightened or threatened. When we look at autonomy, people are more likely to resist if they feel like they're being controlled, if they have no choice or input into how something is going. Now, this is not rocket science. I will often start this section by asking people in my classes. Now, suppose I just paired you up today without dementia and told you to go away to a shower room and your partner was going to strip you naked and give you a shower. That would be hard enough, but what are some of the things that your partner could do to you that might make you want to resist them? And I get a list of things from the class, and the list of things are all those same things. Well, if they don't tell me what they're about to do, if the water's too cold, if I'm exposed, if I don't have any say in what's going on, if they're treating me like a piece of meat and not talking to me like a human being, so it's not rocket science how the shower should go. It's the same with people with dementia. But the deeper thing is that well-being is something that is so universally important, and yet we've never been taught how to bring this to people. And so what I've focused on in my trainings has been, how do you operationalize these domains of well-being? Because the truth is, it's often not about the shower itself or that episode of care where the person is being resistive. It's often about the fact that the person has no well-being all day long. And if you're walking around and all of your, if you look at the well-being domains as 7 glasses that you would like to have full, and think that the person without well-being who's not being supported by the care environment is walking around with those glasses on empty, is kind of like a tea kettle that's just about on the boil. You are right on your last nerve all day long. So if you're walking around feeling so stressed and so low in well-being, what are the times when you are most likely to blow your gasket? Probably when someone's got you naked in the shower or is trying to do things to you. So combativeness is not just about changing the way we provide care. It's about filling those glasses. It's about giving people more well-being all day. So it's not just about changing the shower. It's about what do we do in the background 24/7 to give people a better sense of autonomy all day long. How do we give people a better sense of security all day long? And then over into the other well-being domains too. So maybe one of the things that makes people frightened during a shower is the fact that at a different time of day, the team members are walking in the room without knocking or identifying themselves. So the person is constantly in the state of fear, doesn't want to close their eyes at night because they don't know who's going to come walking in their room while they're asleep. So they're constantly on edge. Or maybe it's one of those things I've seen a million times where I've worked, where the person's in the middle of a shower naked, and all of a sudden another carer sticks their head in the door and says, "Hey, when you're done there, can you come down and help me out in room 3?" And here's this person sitting there naked while somebody they don't know has poked their head in the door. So these things are things we do that erodes a sense of security when we don't ask for people's input into every task, into every step of the task. We often are eroding autonomy. And so by giving these things back all day, we can put the person in a place where they are not so stressed, where they can undergo things that would bother all of us, like personal care, without getting to the point where they feel like they have to fight. And I use an acronym for personal care, which is the word C, S-E-E. The S stands for slow down because we're usually going too fast for people. The first E stands for empower. I'm sorry, the first E stands for engage, which means don't just do a task to a person, but engage the person. Talk to them, share the space with them, and engage them in doing the task with you. And the third is empower. Give the person the ability to direct the task. Check in with them frequently. Get consent for each step. Make sure that you're doing it the way they want. Always ask for input, even if they can't do it themselves. And by doing this, you can go a long way toward improving this. Dr. Yiska Cohen-Mansfield, who's done probably more psychosocial research in dementia than anyone in the world, did a study several years ago where she looked at people who were resistive or combative during care. And what she found, even as an observer who came in and didn't know the residents, was that in the vast majority of cases, she could tie that resistiveness directly to the way they were being approached by the care partner. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It means that we just haven't figured out how to approach the person in a way that helps them feel safe and in control. And there's two ways we can look at it. Again, we can say they have a behavior problem, in which case we just keep pushing through it and we keep getting beat up. Or we can stop and we can say, what is this person teaching me now about my approach, and how might I do it differently? And if we're open to that kind of view, then theoretically all those episodes should be able to be cured without any medication, simply by understanding what the person needs and changing our approach.
So you've got several more questions. The next one is, can you talk more?
Less long-winded then, so I can get more of them done.
Can you talk more about negotiating with the person to find a mutually acceptable risk and autonomy balance?
Yeah, that's really good. I think the important thing is to always have the person in there, always hear what the person has to say. There may be a point where you have to set some limits. And I just want to remind people that empowerment always has limits. So empowerment doesn't just mean you can go and do it. Otherwise, when your child turns 16, you'd throw them the car keys and say, see you later, which you don't do. You actually take your life in the hands and get in the front seat with them for a while and teach them what to do. So when you're discussing things with people, it is okay to do it within certain parameters. If you get a driver's license, you can drive anywhere you want in the country, but you still have to stop when the light turns red. So there are ways you can keep choice from being overly dangerous. So make sure the person is involved, talk to them frankly about your concerns, and work with them to find the best compromise you can. How can we help you do this in a way that helps us all feel safe, but gives you the freedom to do what you want to do? And by going deeper with that step 2 and finding out the values of the person and finding out what they value about being able to do it, what it means to them to be able to do something, you may be able to satisfy them without necessarily going to the letter of the law. So a person that won't give up the car keys may not think they're a perfect driver. It may be more about their fear of losing all choice and control, because that's what we do. As soon as dad can't drive, we take the car keys away and we take over every other decision. So helping the person to know that they are still in charge, and that, yeah, maybe we can't do that quite yet, but we want to help you do as much as you can, and we want you to keep telling us how you feel and stay in charge. We can help give the person more confidence that they're going to remain an active partner. And the people living with dementia always say nothing about me without me. And I think that's just a good watchword for any discussion. It always should have the person in the room, no matter what you think their capabilities are.
All right, here you go. Can you elaborate more on a statement you made early in the webinar, that failure-free activities have no meaning?
Yeah,
or
that was the part
I hear you correctly?
No, that's correct. That was the part I kind of glossed over because the talk runs long. But let me say something about that. I won't tell the story. It's a wonderful story, but we're running short of time. Basically, if I came to you as an activity professional and I said, okay, everybody, we're going to do a really fun game. I have a crossword puzzle here, and I drew one big square on the flip chart and said, okay, what I need here is a letter of the alphabet. Give me a letter. And somebody yelled the letter B, and I put it in there and said, great, you solved the puzzle. Wasn't that fun? Wouldn't you like to do it again? Well, you wouldn't. And what I realized is the only time anyone ever has a feeling of meaning or purpose or accomplishment is when they do something where they might have failed. Because if there's no chance you can fail, then there's nothing to be gained. There's no meaning or purpose in getting it right. And so it really shifted my thinking. Instead of giving failure-free activities to people, we have to think about how can we provide engagement or activities in which a person can safely fail from time to time, because otherwise there's no point in even doing it. There's no sense of satisfaction or meaning. And nothing we have done that we are proud of in our lives was done without a risk of failure. That's what makes us proud. That's what gives us the self-esteem and self-satisfaction. And so we have to just get away from this idea that we have to put people in a sanitized bubble where they can never get hurt. My friend Court Nygaard used to say, if you believe that people should be failure-free and risk-free, then after this talk, I've got a bus and I'm going to get whoever wants to on the bus, and we're going to take you to a place to live where nothing could ever possibly go wrong, where everything is completely sanitized. How many people want to get on that bus? And of course, no one ever raises their hand.
I'm going to let folks know we're going to run a little longer today.
Yeah,
if you need to leave the call, leave the call, but we're going to record this so I can cover all the questions that are in the chat box. So Al, as long as you've got time, we've got more
Sure.
questions, and I think they're great questions, and I really want to make sure they're a part of our recording. So here's the next one. My mother is in assisted living where her meds are kept in a locked cabinet in her apartment. 3 times a day, someone unlocks the cabinet to give her her meds. Each time, it is an insult to her dignity and autonomy that makes her angry, upset, etc. What are your recommendations?
Well, I guess the first question I would have is this somebody who could self-administer her medications? Because I think that's a key question. If she can self-administer her medications, then there's really no reason, particularly in assisted living, but even in long-term care, why she shouldn't be able to do that. If there are concerns about her not taking them properly, then once again, I think we need to have discussion. If she's insulted by that, we need to talk about how we need to just, how she's there, we're there to help her, how we need to uh, keep track of her medications to make sure that she's getting them and they're not harming her, and ask her what's a better way that we could do it that would be less insulting to her. Is there a different way we could store them? Is there a different way we could administer them to her? Could she come and unlock the box with us and take them herself while we just note them on a notepad so that we are all satisfied that the medication is working and that she's not having any side effects? I mean, I can't give the exact circumstances. Each discussion is going to be very unique. But once again, it's all about engaging the person and helping them. And it's interesting because, you know, the greenhouse model sees the locked box in the room as a great improvement over the med cart, which I believe it is. But it's interesting that even that can be an affront to people who are so concerned about choice and control. So I think that's a very interesting question. And it shows that the discussions never end. Even in a beautiful greenhouse household, the discussions never end and the challenges never end either.
So speaking of stories, do you have any particular success stories to share when you've educated a family about autonomy?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'll share. Well, the first one that comes to mind is one that Daniela tells all the time in her talk about dedicated assignments. She talked about a woman who would come in and was very demanding with the staff at the time when they were still rotating. And she would say that she wanted her mother up at 7 every morning and she wanted her going to all the activities because she had in her mind that this was good for her and it would keep her dementia from progressing as rapidly. And the staff, of course, were being beat up because this woman did not want to get up at 7 in the morning and she did not want to go to everything that was offered. And they could never convince her daughter that this was something their mother didn't want. She didn't trust them. And when they moved to dedicated staffing, which in the case of our care was not once a month or even once a year, it is working at least 3 shifts a week, no casual per diems, and also with the exact same people all the time, permanently. And what she found was that the level of conflict, not only with this daughter, but with family members in general, went way down, virtually disappeared, because the relationship and the trust were built. And therefore, a Shabazz or a CNA, whom a family member may not have trusted when they were constantly shifting positions, all of a sudden became someone that they knew well and that they developed familiarity and trust with. And that CNA was able to convince the daughter that this was not her mother's wish, it was not good for her, and the daughter changed her view and was able to let go and let her mother make that decision for herself and understand that at 90 she ought to be able to decide those things. So the
Mm,
relationships are really everything.
you're here to that. Here's one. It's actually a comment and then somewhat of a question at the end. I love that families are suing communities for giving drugs. Can we work with more families to advocate for and sue if necessary for excess safety policies?
Well, I'll
So I'll
tell you,
let you respond.
I just personally, I always decline those calls for 2 reasons. I mean, I talk to them. I always decline to participate for 2 reasons. Number one, because trials go on forever, and once you agree to be part of something, when there are appeals 10 years later, you have to change your travel plans and show up in court. So I didn't want to commit myself all over the country. Plus, you know, because I worked in long-term care for 25 years, I did work as an expert. Giving expert opinions to a lawyer who defended nursing homes, but I didn't ever want to put myself in the position of an expert witness for prosecutions against nursing homes because I know how hard it is, and I know that people get pushed up against the wall, and it's often not the fault of an individual who gives a pill. It's the fault of the system and the fact that they have not move to the place where they can be more innovative. But, there's nobody, I don't think, out there who speaks out against the use of these drugs more than I do. I just gave a talk to the doctors and pharmacists affiliated and directors of nursing affiliated with Schlegel Villages just on Tuesday evening. Had a 3-hour dinner talk about this, really challenged all the medical precepts behind the use of these drugs. And I think education is really the key. And if people want to litigate because there's harm, they have right to do that. There's bad practice out there. And I don't think there should never be lawsuits, but I do think that education and once again, building relationships is really the key. At our care, when they moved to dedicated staffing, since each of those 33 communities moved to dedicated staff assignments around people living with dementia, they have had formal family complaints at each community go to zero, absolutely zero.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't mean the family members are always happy, but what it means is when they are unhappy, where do they go? They go to the team whom they know well, who's caring for their loved one, and they discuss it and solve it there. It was no longer being kicked up to the DON or the administrator or anybody else in the organization through the formal complaint process because there was a relationship there that wasn't there before.
Well, let's carry on kind of an education theme. Here's one. We are in the process of developing a dementia care facility in a small rural BC community. Do you have a strategy for educating health authorities about the efficacy of your model? We love it, but we are struggling with funding bodies.
All I can say is I will educate anybody who wants to bring me there to educate them. I've spoken to family members, I've spoken to surveyors, I've spoken to professionals, I've spoken to people living with dementia and other people living in communities who don't live with dementia. I've spoken to our local high school where my kids attended when they were younger. It's about having these conversations and educating, and I'm willing to do it. And I know there are other people like Susan and others who have very aligned philosophies who are willing to do these things too. We have been taught a way of looking at dementia that is very limited and limiting, very stigmatized, and we need to change that. And we're working against a huge system, but we keep chipping away at it and doing everything we can. And I would invite you all to look at that document, the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And even though the US, who is not much of a joiner, hasn't joined the other 175 countries in ratifying this convention, it gives a very strong statement as to the human rights of people with dementia and truly even with disabilities. Just because you have a disability or develop a condition like dementia, you don't lose your basic human rights. And when we speak about it from the standpoint of rights, that's a hard thing to argue. And just as a little clue, this is a little subversive for me to say, but if you are working in long-term care and you have what you consider to be an unfair survey finding, and you really feel that you should contest it, but you're not sure how you can safely and successfully do that, my advice to you is if you can find that that survey finding is impacting on the individual's rights, that is your best argument to reverse a deficiency, because the number one FTAG 151 that surveyors have is the resident rights statement. And if their findings are not upholding that FTAG, then you got your foot in the door to reverse things. And we at St. John's actually were able to reverse a couple of findings by talking about resident rights and talking about the fact that what they were doing was not helping residents to have their rights supported.
Okay, here's one. The importance of driving. The mini mental exam showed mild cognitive impairment and later diagnosis of dementia. It resulted in the suspension of driving. She had only one minor accident in her life related to ice and never a ticket of any kind. Can you comment, please?
Yeah, driving is a very tricky thing, and there are different opinions about this, so I can only give you mine because there are people who would disagree with me. There are some people that believe that there are subtle changes in attention and judgment that are such that anyone who's formally diagnosed with dementia should give up driving and that there's no gray area. There are other people who believe that there can be nuances between yes and no. And I'm one of those people that tends to lean more toward the nuances. I've actually ridden in the car with people who've been diagnosed with dementia, at least one individual who was diagnosed with dementia a decade ago, and I never felt unsafe and never was afraid to do that. But once again, I think there are different ways you can go about this besides yes or no. You can say only drive during the daytime or when the weather's nice, or just to your local house of worship or local store within a certain radius, or maybe just when there's someone in the car. But I think rather than mini mental stats, which is so gross, coarse, I mean, and non-specific, it's much better if there's any concern to do a functional assessment where someone who's a trained instructor or evaluator actually gets in the car and observes somebody, because the numbers on the mini mental don't mean anything. And mild cognitive impairment is a real, it's a real uh, can of worms, I'll tell you, because it is quickly gaining the same stigma of dementia. Some people with mild cognitive impairment do progress to have a formal diagnosis of dementia. But now that we've had that category for over a decade, what we're finding is that a lot of people with mild cognitive impairment never go on to a formal diagnosis of dementia, and some of them go back to normal again. And but you know, I met somebody at this Mayo talk 2 weeks ago who said she'd been diagnosed with MCI and already her family members were taking everything away from her as if she were incapable. And so it's a real slippery slope. And even if you think driving is a problem, once again, don't think about driving, think about autonomy. What the car represents is freedom. That's what the car keys represent. So if you feel someone can't drive, how can you engage them in the process so that they can know that whatever they want to do, you will support their ability to do it if they can't be the one driving the car. They won't lose their choice. They won't lose their opinion just because they hand over a set of car keys. That is really the fear that drives a lot of people to be so resistive. And I understand that. I mean, we live in a society that has not really developed good infrastructure for people that can't drive. We have suburbs where if you don't have a car, forget it. You can't even get a loaf of bread, let alone do anything else you want. And so we need to solve those. We can't just say you can't drive. We need to understand how the person wants to live, and we need to offer a better solution so that the person has a reason to give up the keys.
Right. Comment a little bit on music and memory. You know a little bit about
Yes.
that.
Well,
The
I was in
music
the
and
movie
memory
Alive Inside.
program.
I had the typical Hollywood experience. I had 8 hours of footage and live inside, and you can see me for about 15 seconds in the movie. So there's a lot of footage of me doing something somewhere that may show up again someday. You never know. But music and memory, first of all, is a wonderful wonderful tool for engagement. I know Dan Cohen well. I'm on the advisory board for music and memory. I have seen it do absolutely phenomenal and magical things to unlock the abilities and the engagement of people living with dementia who otherwise are having difficulty doing so. Having said that, we have to be careful that we don't confuse the tool with the whole world. Um, when, what bothers me the most when I see how people might use this is that what this is just a tool for engagement. It's a way to get people to be more fluent with their language, to improve their memories, to better engage with those around them. So the last thing I would want people to do is to get somebody out of bed, get them dressed, stick the headphones on, stick them in a corner, and leave them there all day. Because when you open that door to engagement, communication, and memory, you need to walk through that door. Sit there. That's the perfect time when the person can't tell you much at other times of day to find out more about them, to learn them, to learn more about them, to discuss what they want, to discuss choices. But use that as a tool for engagement. Don't use it as just sort of an activity where you stick somebody off by themselves listening to their music. They might prefer that type of solitude from time to time, but don't think that that alone is going to change a person's life. And the other thing is that, like all other so-called non-pharmacologic approaches, it doesn't work if it's not what the person needs. So if a person is trying to go outside, like in the story I tell in my second book, because it's a retired farmer who sees a herd of cows in the pasture behind the assisted living home, and they are used to checking on the cows and want to go out and see the cows. Music and memory is not going to help that person because he doesn't want to listen to music. He wants to check the cows. So what we often do with non-pharmacologic approaches is we just apply these things to people. Let's give them music and memory. Let's have them fold washcloths for an hour a day without any regard to what the person really needs. If we don't understand the individual and tailor the approach to what that person needs, then it's not a solution. So it is a great tool, but like any tool, you don't use a hammer to turn a screw. You have to use a right tool in the right situation.
All right, I'm just going to read a couple more, but here's one. I have an 80-year-old brother who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. He lives alone in a 2-story house in the Boston area. As his brother living in Houston, I am the only responsible family member. I take the position that even though he may be at risk, he is much happier living where he insists on remaining. What do you think?
Well, I say in principle, good for you. I think that's the kind of approach we need to start from. Obviously, someone on the call can come up with a situation where we might reverse our thinking because there's imminent danger to himself or others. But I think that the world of disability has taught us that you should always assume capacity until it's proven otherwise. And with dementia, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to assume incapacity. And sure, there's always risk. And as I said, as Bill Thomas says, the only risk-free human environment is a coffin. Now, maybe a person with Alzheimer's living alone could fall down the stairs. Maybe they could skip a meal. Maybe they could leave the stove on. But we have to assess the reality of that and balance it with the downside of forcing someone to move from a home, to give up much of that independence and well-being, to move into a place that may not recognize their need for independence and choice and control and meaningful engagement. And once again, and I had to go through this in my own life with my mother, who doesn't live with dementia, but is old and frail and currently chair-bound, wheelchair-bound with short distance walking. But at a time before that happened, she was walking up and down our cellar stairs to do laundry in the basement, and I went through the same thing everybody else does. I expressed my concerns and tried to get her to get someone to come in and do her laundry for her, and her feeling was, this is my house, and this is how I stay active, and this is meaningful to me because I can't do much else for anybody. And if I fall down the stairs and hit my head and die, well, I've done it in my own house. And we all have to learn to take a deep breath and let go and think about ourselves and say, what would we want in that situation, and when do we have the right to tell other people how to live their lives? So I commend you for taking that posture. And while it may not work 100% of the time, I think that's where we have to start.
So I'm going to just read one more question. Unfortunately, we are going to have to draw to a close. But the question is, are there any research questions you feel would support the approach that you posit? How could we measure these outcomes?
It's a good question. I haven't thought about specific to choice versus risk. What I'm doing, I have a well-being approach to decoding and responding to distress, which I gave a very superficial description of when I talked about how to use well-being to address a person being resistive during care. And what I'm doing now that I'm at the RIA in Canada is I'm starting to work with our new research chair, Dr. Carrie McCaney, to formally study the well-being approach, because I've seen amazing anecdotal success in helping people to live better and to reduce antipsychotics, but I want to actually have something publishable rather than just anecdotal successes. I think probably we could look at negotiating risk and autonomy too. But in this short period of time, I haven't thought enough about what the research questions would be. And I'm not a researcher. I'm not allowed to do research without a grown up in the room. But now that I have Carrie and the other folks at the RIA who are researchers, that's something I'll have to ask her about, because she is an expert in mixed method research, not only measuring quantitative outcomes such as falls or things like that, but also the qualitative outcomes. What does this do for a person's self-esteem, for their quality of life, and how do we capture the experience of the person, the experience of her care partners during the process of negotiating risk. So I need people that are smarter than me to work on that, but I think it is very much something that needs to be studied, because once again, human rights are something that we all get behind and talk about, but there are a certain number of people who are not going to change policy until they see some sort of data or some sort of publication. And I think it's been one of the failings of culture change, but actually a success of the greenhouse model, that we have not, in general, done enough studies showing the benefits of changing our approach. And Greenhouse has done a good job with several aspects of that, and hopefully will continue to do so.
Al, I hate to end it. I mean, this is
I know,
fascinating,
great
and
time.
there are more questions. And so here's what I do want to say to both you, Al, and to our participants on the call. We will have Al back. And, this was the first in a series of webinars that we will be doing on dementia. And we will be featuring our best life approach. And so we will have you back, Al. And to all of you who gave your questions, thank you for those questions. I wish we had time to listen to them all.
If there's anything burning, Susan, we'll be talking in the future. We can either discuss it on the phone or you can flip me a couple of emails, and when I have time, I can get back to you and you can send them out to participants, but we can try to get a few questions answered. Or like you say, we could always do a part 2 and just open it up to lots more discussion.
We will do a part 2. And so Rachel has the attendee list, and we will make sure that everybody gets notified of when part 2 will be. So please check our website for the next webinar, April 11th. It's continuing our business case series. And the workforce series, the next one in that one, will be on May 3. Thank you again, Dr. Power, and thank you again to all of you who took your time today to be with us.
Thanks,
all right,
everybody.
Take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.